December 7, 1941, a date which lives in infamy. Most people see the smoke over Oahu and the sinking of the USS Arizona as a sudden, isolated tragedy. But history is rarely a sequence of accidents. It is a sequence of math. If you look beneath the waves of the Pacific and behind the cockpit of the Zero fighters, you find a much darker reality. By the late 1930s, the United States was trapped. The New Deal, Franklin D. Roosevelt's massive attempt to spend his way out of the Great Depression, was failing. Unemployment was creeping back up. The debt-to-GDP ratio was reaching levels that terrified the traditionalists in Washington. America was an industrial giant standing on a crumbling floor of paper credit. But then, the bombs fell, and suddenly, the impossible became necessary. The economic gears that were rusted shut by political gridlock and fear were suddenly lubricated by the blood of a national emergency. Today, we ask the question that few dare to voice. Was Pearl Harbor the tragedy that destroyed a peaceful nation, or was it the only exit ramp from a total economic collapse? To understand 1941, we have to look at the geometry of time. In the world of long-wave cycles, there is a rhythm of roughly 84 years, the time it takes for a generation to forget the lessons of the previous crisis. From the total mobilization of 1941, we land exactly in the mid-2000s. The patterns are screaming at us from the ledgers of history. Then, as now, we see a world choked by sovereign debt. Then, as now, we see the rise of multipolar powers challenging the existing financial order. And then, as now, the global economy is addicted to a level of spending that can only be sustained by a state of permanent emergency. Keeping a massive industrial engine running peacefully is the greatest trick in history, a trick that, quite frankly, has almost never been successfully performed. In 1941, the United States found its solution in the arsenal of democracy. But what was the cost of that solution? It wasn't just the lives of sailors in the Pacific. It was the birth of a military-industrial complex that would demand constant growth, constant friction, and constant threat to remain solvent. In the 2 years leading up to the attack, the American economy was a paradox. Roosevelt had tried to pivot to a peacetime recovery, but the numbers didn't lie. Every time the government tried to pull back on stimulus, the markets crashed. The American dollar was a king without a kingdom. Europe was already burning, and the gold reserves of the old world were fleeing across the Atlantic, filling the vaults of New York. But you cannot eat gold. You cannot build a future on the debts of dying empires unless you are willing to step into the vacuum they leave behind. The Pacific Theater wasn't just a battle for islands. It was a battle for the right to dictate the next 84 years of global trade. The isolationists in America wanted to stay behind their ocean walls, but the math of the debt cycle demanded expansion. Pearl Harbor didn't just end the debate between isolationism and interventionism. It solved the problem of the liquidity trap. It allowed the Federal Reserve to monetize a level of debt that would have been considered treasonous only months prior. The war didn't just end the Depression. It restructured the very DNA of the American dollar. It turned the greenback from a currency of a republic into the currency of an empire. As we stand here today, 84 years later, we are staring at the same ledger. The debt has returned, the friction is heating up, and the world is once again looking for an exit. To truly understand why the Pacific became a graveyard of ships, you have to stop looking at maps and start looking at balance sheets. By 1940, the United States wasn't just a country. It was a global landlord. But Japan was the tenant that refused to pay and instead started building its own apartment complex next door. Since the 1920s, American capital, led by the House of Morgan and the Titans of Wall Street, had been deeply embedded in the industrialization of Asia. They saw the Pacific not as a strategic barrier, but as a vast, untapped market for American credit. However, Japan's new order in East Asia was a direct threat to the dollar's supremacy. Japan wanted an economy backed by resources and steel, not by the Federal Reserve's debt. When Washington froze Japanese assets in July 1941, it wasn't just a diplomatic slap on the wrist. It was a financial execution. By cutting off 90% of Japan's oil and freezing every cent they held in American banks, the U.S. effectively backed Tokyo into a corner where the only currency left was violence. The decision-makers in the Treasury Department knew this. They weren't surprised by the escalation. They had calculated the cost of the friction. Why would America risk a world war over trade routes? Because of the 84-year debt imperative. The system created after World War I was based on the Golden Loop, a fragile circle of loans that we discussed in our previous investigations. By 1941, that loop had snapped. The only way to forge a new one was to become the undisputed manager of the world's resources. In the months leading up to Pearl Harbor, the invisible hand of the market was shaking. The British Empire, America's largest debtor, was essentially insolvent. They were fighting for their lives, but they were also running out of things to pawn. Wall Street faced a terrifying prospect. If the British fell and Japan dominated Asia, trillions in projected American wealth would simply vanish. The American financial elite realized that peace was becoming more expensive than war. A peaceful 1942 meant a return to the soup lines of 1932. But a wartime 1942 meant the total mobilization of the American workforce, the creation of the middle class through government-funded manufacturing, and the replacement of the British pound with the U.S. dollar as the world's anchor. When the first torpedoes hit the battleships in Roe, they didn't just sink steel. They sank the old financial world. Within 24 hours of the attack, the political barriers to infinite spending vanished. The same Congress that had fought FDR over every penny for social programs suddenly handed him a blank check. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. government would spend over $300 billion. To put that in perspective, that was more than the government had spent in the entire 150 years prior. Where did that money come from? It was borrowed from the future. It was the largest margin call in human history. This is the core of the 84-year cycle. Every 8 decades, the system reaches a point of total saturation. The debts become unpayable, the growth becomes stagnant, and the only way to reset the clock is a great reset of the global order. Pearl Harbor provided the moral and political cover for a financial expansion that would have been impossible in peacetime. It allowed the United States to pivot from a struggling domestic economy to a global military financial empire. Today, as we look at the soaring debt levels of the 2020s, we have to ask, is the system once again waiting for its day of infamy to justify the next trillion-dollar expansion? History doesn't just repeat, it invoices us for the debts of the past. While the battleships were still smoldering in the Pacific, a different kind of conquest was happening in the quiet corridors of the U.S. Treasury. The British Empire, the global hegemon of the previous century, was on its knees. But for America, this wasn't just about saving a cousin across the Atlantic, it was about a forced merger. Enter Lend-Lease. History books often describe it as a generous act of the arsenal of democracy. But in the world of cycles and ledgers, Lend-Lease was the ultimate leverage. In exchange for the ships, planes, and fuel needed to survive, Britain was forced to sign away its future. They were forced to dismantle their system of imperial preference, the trade barriers that kept the British pound dominant. The American planners, led by figures like Harry Dexter White, were cold and calculated. They knew that by 1941, the 84-year cycle of British dominance was over. It was time for a new creditor to take the throne. The Destroyers for Bases agreement wasn't a fair trade. It was a liquidation sale. Britain traded its strategic island bases, its global anchors, for 50 aging American destroyers. The lion was selling its teeth just to stay alive. To pay for the war, Britain had to empty its pockets until they were inside out. In 1940 and 1941, the gold run was in full effect. Ships laden with the British Empire's gold reserves sailed across the Atlantic to the vaults of New York and Fort Knox. America was literally buying the old world's wealth for the price of manufacturing. But it wasn't enough. When the gold ran out, Washington demanded that British companies in America be sold off at fire sale prices. Brands and industries that took a century to build were liquidated in weeks to pay for American-made shells. This was the moment the 84-year cycle reached its apex, the total transfer of global collateral from London to New York. The golden loop was being rewritten. No longer would the world revolve around the city of London. From 1941 onwards, every bullet fired by an Allied soldier carried an American invoice. The debt wasn't just a number, it was a geopolitical shackle. By the time the U.S. fully entered the war after Pearl Harbor, they didn't just have the best army, they owned the debt of every other army on the field. Pearl Harbor was the catalyst that allowed the U.S. to move from supplier to owner. If the 1920s were about lending money to keep the world stable, the 1940s were about using war to ensure that only one currency, the U.S. dollar, would survive the wreckage. This is the peaceful trick that failed. The world couldn't transition from the 19th century colonial economy to the 20th century consumer economy without a total demolition of the old guard. The war provided that demolition. It cleared the board of the British pound, the French franc, and the German mark, leaving a vacuum that only the dollar could fill. As we look at our current cycle 84 years from 1941, we see a similar clearing of the board beginning to take shape. The old systems of 1944, built at Bretton Woods, are trembling. The debt levels of the modern era have reached the same liquidation point that Britain reached in 1940. When the system can no longer pay its interest with gold or trade, it begins to pay with its assets, its sovereignty, and eventually, its peace. History is not a straight line. It is a spiral. Every 84 years, the financial sins of the fathers are visited upon the sons. In 1941, the world reached a terminal point where debt could no longer be managed by banks. It had to be managed by cannons. Today, as we cross the threshold into 2026, the arithmetic of the global economy has returned to that same terrifying 0 hour. The system built in the wake of Pearl Harbor, the Bretton Woods order, the petrodollar, the era of infinite American credit, is exhausted. The 84-year cycle tells us that the golden loop has completed its rotation. In 1942, the solution was the total mobilization of the industrial world. In 2026, the challenge is even greater. How do you reset a system where the debt is no longer held in gold marks or pounds, but in trillions of digital entries that the world can no longer afford to interest? We must return to the question, can a war-based economy ever truly pivot back to peace without a collapse? In 1945, America tried. They built the suburbs, the highways, and the consumer dream. But look closer at the ledgers. The peace was actually a Cold War. The spending never stopped. It just changed its label. We didn't solve the debt loop of 1941, we simply socialized it across the entire globe. Now, the bill is due. The 84-year resonance suggests that we are entering the liquidation phase of the American century. Just as the British Empire had to pawn its jewels and bases in 1941, the modern global order is being forced to choose between its currency and its stability. The friction we see in the headlines today, the trade wars, the regional conflicts, the crumbling of alliances, is not random. It is the sound of the system trying to find a new Pearl Harbor moment to justify the next great monetary reset. The final lesson of 1941 is that the greatest casualty of war is not just life or property, but the truth of the ledger. War allows governments to do what is financially impossible in peace. It allows them to default on the past and borrow from a future that hasn't happened yet. As we navigate the turbulence of the mid-2000s, remember the 84-year cycle. We are not just living through a political crisis. We are living through a mathematical inevitability. The archives document shows that the ink in the world's ledger never truly dries. The invoices of 1941 were paid in 2010, but the invoices we are signing today will dictate the lives of those born in the next century. The question is no longer, when will the cycle end? The question is, how will you position yourself before the loop closes? Because if history proves anything, it's that the debt is eternal, but the empires that carry it are not. Thank you for joining this deep investigation into the hidden side of history. If you want to understand the cycles that govern our world, hit the subscribe button and explore our previous videos on the debt loop. The more we know about the past, the less we have to fear from the future. This is Archives document. Stay curious and stay vigilant.